Guys, the 250th is coming. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, 3 if by everywhere in the country things are happening for the 250th. And as someone who took a couple's vacation with my poor burdened fiance to Mount Vernon and Monticello and Montpelier in order to do research for my comprehensive examinations, my Mount Vernon sweater, as someone whom people regularly gift things like George Washington Funko Pops, I have thoughts and feelings about this. Especially as someone who also does videos like things you can watch, like my Read to Resist video, which I did last President's Day, because I'm getting a PhD in elementary social studies and I have thoughts and feelings about how we talk about, teach, and just think about history in this country. I haven't done one of my American Presidential Reading Challenge videos in a while, and this is technically not one of them. This is part of a series of videos I want to do throughout the summer. I have 2, maybe 3 planned to give you guys some of my favorites in case you would like to do some reading this summer, some excellent nonfiction that will go beyond the usual narrative that we hear about. In this video, for example, the American Revolution, we're going to revisit that and think about the things that we didn't learn about in school that happened in some great books that I've read that I'd love to recommend to you. And then I might do some more general, like 250th, like kind of reframing situations, again, with great nonfiction that exists out there that you will really enjoy reading, that you will learn a lot from, and, just go away with something beyond the traditional beats of the narrative as we normally hear it. Obviously, since July 4th is coming up, I wanted to start with the American Revolution specifically as someone who has published a lot of work now about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and thinking about that a lot. Again, I just wanted to share with you some of my favorites that really just kind of helped me rethink and reframe specifically the American Revolution. What I want to do is start narrow, if you will, and go broad, by which I mean we're going to start with some books about some people very important to the American Revolution, and then we're going to go broad. Because one of the things that is often forgotten about the American Revolution is that it is at once a civil war and a global conflict, right? It becomes essentially a world war and a civil war all at the same time, and we're going to talk about it. So starting with the single most important person often brought up to the entire American Revolution is George Washington. Obviously, I have thoughts and feelings about this guy. And one of my favorite biographies of George Washington is You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington by Alexis Coe. I've talked about this book before and I will talk about it again. If you are looking for a comprehensive biography on George Washington, like that 800-page epic situation, you probably are going to prefer Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize winner, which I've read, or some other ones. I mean, I think I have videos up in this list where I've got 6 or 7, 11, 25,000 books on George Washington that I've read. This is my favorite and goes into the theme of this video because it's not a comprehensive biography. Instead, Alexis Coe goes through the events of George Washington's life and talks about the way that we've talked about them. So, for example, one of my favorite anecdotes, which is one where Alexis is talking about how Ron Chernow writes about George's mom, Mrs. Washington, and how in Ron Chernow's biography, he kind of paints George's mom as kind of shrewish, maybe kind of really on him, and Alexis goes and shows the evidence for that, the primary source evidence, and basically how Ron Chernow got that from one line in one letter George Washington wrote once. She talks about how we talk about his military prowess, but he lost more battles than he won. Now again, this is not at all to say that this is a negative biography on George Washington, but again, Alexis is rather looking at the historical storytelling about George Washington and kind of peeling back those layers and thinking about Washington as he actually was, rather than the stories that we tell. It's not an 800-page epic. It's very accessible. It's quite funny. Like I said, if you want the details of an 800-page epic, this is not going to be for you. But if you're interested in the way that we tell the story of George Washington, it's really incredible. I talk to people about it all the time. I cite it all the time in my research because she just has like great anecdotes, like that line about George Washington's mom, that again really help us to think about how we tell these stories in biographies and where some of this information or this thinking is coming from. Speaking about where thinking is coming from, I want to talk to you guys about this book that I read called First Principles: What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country by Thomas Ricks. Now, this is a really interesting book that goes back into the schooling and philosophical thinking of four major founders: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. So again, stepping back just from George Washington into these four major players into the Revolution, because a lot of times the things that we talk about in the broad general idea is that, these founders were all, using inspiration from the Greeks and Romans to like consider the American Republic and what that would be. But this book is really interesting, and it drills down into the specific Greeks or Romans specifically that each of these thinkers used to like craft their philosophical background. And George Washington, he did not have the education of these other three guys. So with him, it's more thinking about Cincinnatus and like how he was interacting with some of these ideas as someone who didn't have the classical education that like Thomas Jefferson had, for example. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, famously very, very like erudite scholars, and Alexander Hamilton also was as well, but again, his education's a little bit different than theirs since he was bouncing around a little bit more. And so this really helps us to pick apart, not just saying broadly, oh, they were inspired by the Greeks and Romans, and like that's how they came up with the idea of the American Republic, blah, blah, blah. Like thinking about how each of these men, their specific conceptualization and philosophical thinking and leaning draws back to the specific Greek or Roman thinker that they thought was like the best. It's really interesting as someone who is interested in education and how education shapes who we are as people. But again, just generally like kind of picking apart that narrative of, they all thought, if not the same, then similarly, and they were inspired by the same or similar things. Like, yes, but also no. And you can see how their education and their conceptualization of some of these ideas then, goes into the documents that they write or the things that they say. So yeah, it's just like a really unique and interesting take on the backgrounds of these four guys and how that ended up shaping our country, as each of them played a very, very significant role in our founding documents and founding ideas. If you want a book that is more like a travelogue and includes some what-ifery, then I have a really incredible book for you. This one is called Revolutionary Roads: Searching for the War That Made America Independent, ... and all the places it could have gone terribly wrong, by Bob Thompson. This is a very interesting book. So Thompson went and he like traveled to different places where major battles of the American Revolution took place. And he thinks about the history of those battles, the stories that we have, while looking at the actual topography and where things are in relation to each other, like the difference of a hill on one side or not, right? And so this is a book that's a little different than a lot of history books, because a lot of historians would say that you cannot engage in what-ifery, like if this had happened, then what if this had happened, what if this had happened? And Bob Thompson does that, where he imagines how the like space and the topography and the actual physical like places that these battles happened in may or may not have affected the outcome, or what would have happened if the weather was different on that day or something like that. It definitely reads like a travelogue. Obviously, Bob Thompson's a little bit of a part of this because he's traveling to all of these places, and some of these places look very different now than they did in the 1700s. But it is just like a really interesting and fun time. I've never seen anything quite like that, except for Nathaniel Philbrick did write a book called Travels with George, which is very similar but following the path of George Washington. It's very similar and you might find it interesting. I thought that Bob Thompson's was more interesting because it hits on like more battles in different places and isn't following a person, but rather thinking about these larger things, which is why I included it in this video. But I did want to also mention that one in case this idea of a book sounds interesting to you. I haven't read this, but there's also a very, again, similar idea, Travels with Jefferson, about his travels in France. I don't know the author on that one because I'm only just remembering that it exists as I'm filming. But it's like, again, kind of like these travelogue-y books where you can really dive into physical place that are very interesting. So if you are interested in that and you're okay with some what-ifery, Bob Thompson's book may be for you. And finally, pulling back the curtain onto the big stage of the American Revolution, again, moving from a civil war fought by individual people, war fought by people who thought different things, the space and place of the places it was fought in America, pulling it back to the global size conflict with The American Revolution and the Fate of the World by Richard Bell. I read this quite recently. I tried to read more books for this, which we'll talk about the books that I didn't get to in a second. But this is a really interesting book where every chapter kind of functions as like a short story, if you will, talking about a different global space and place that was affected by the American Revolution. So of course we know France fights in the war, Spain fights in the war, Britain obviously is involved. There's a lot of different colonial possessions that factor quite heavily into the war, specifically in the Caribbean. And so it really is a global conflict. It will become, once France and Spain are involved, a world war. It's so interesting, both the big and the small ways that either what's happening in America, the fact that the British need to send troops there, or what happens in America when the British decide to remove troops from the American conflict and send them to the Caribbean because they consider their sugar islands more important than these rebellious colonists up here. We also hear about things on the seas, Haiti, like there's so many different stories that are all happening at the same time because they're either directly related to or inspired by the events of the revolution. My only caveat to this book is that because each chapter, again, is really focused on one place, the timeline slides around a lot in this book. And when I listened to it on audiobook, I did have a slight problem following the timeline consistently because, you know, you follow one thing all the way through and you kind of go backward and forward. So I would recommend probably reading this in print, not on audio, just because then you can kind of reference yourself in dates and times and kind of get a better picture more easily of when all of these things are happening kind of concurrently. But this is a great book, again, not an 800-page epic that will give you an incredible snapshot of the global impact of the American Revolution. Now, finally, I want to go with some honorable mentions, and this includes some of my favorite books about the revolution that just kind of didn't fit into the general idea of the 4 books that I just talked about, and also some books that I'm either currently reading or haven't read yet, just because I didn't get around to them in time for this video. So the first honorable mention is the Rick Atkinson series about the revolution. I have read both of these books. The 3rd book needs to come out to kind of finish the trilogy and bring you all the way through the revolution. So that one's not out yet, so it's not like finished. Spoilers. We kind of know how the 3rd book's gonna go. But what is incredible about Rick Atkinson's books is that it's the minutia of the detail. This is like the minute by minute, person by person, like small, like what we would consider like the smaller people, right? It doesn't just follow George Washington or like, yes, they factor into it obviously, but it's got that level of detail where these are your hundreds of pages of epic. You have to be ready for a very slow moving book. But even with that, I listened to them on audio and I was just obsessed. I love listening to these, and it's the type of thing where I thought maybe they would be too slow for me. They've been so good so far. So if you are that person who wants the tiny, tiny, tiny historian's detail as much as a person can physically put into a book and still make a narrative, understanding that these books aren't finished yet, we're going to need that third one to get us all the way through the war. These books are really excellent, and I highly recommend them. On to the book that I'm reading right now is This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South by Alan Pell Crawford. One of the reasons I wanted to read this for this video, and I wanted to bring it up even though I'm not finished with it and therefore cannot give a full verdict on it, is that a lot of times when we talk about the American Revolution, all of our major battles are like, we talk about the war basically in the North, right? As far as we get down is usually Yorktown. But there actually is a significant amount of, if not these major battles in the same way that we think about some of these major battles that we always talk about in school, like major things are happening in the South, and the British at a certain point just kind of turn their focus there. And maybe it's because George Washington's not down there, I don't know, but we don't normally talk about it. And so this is a whole book on that. And I've been very interested in it so far, to learn more in depth about this history that I feel like is usually glossed over in the larger picture. And if you are reading Rick Atkinson's books, what's really interesting about this is that those books, the second book ends as the British are turning their attention to the South. And that's where this book picks up. So not that it's the next book in that series, but it does kind of feel like a continuation of that narrative. And the Atkinson books really gave me a lot of background knowledge to help me understand a little bit more about the book that I'm currently reading. So I, again, have not finished it yet, so I don't want to tell you like my verdict on it. I'm very early going in it, but I do think that it's one of those books that tells a part of the story that we don't normally hear about. And finally, a book that I was hoping to get to but haven't even started yet, but I definitely want to bring up, is Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, The True Story of Robert Townsend and Elizabeth by Claire Bellajot and Tiffany Brooks. I may be saying those names wrong, that's fine. I actually met one of the authors of this at a history conference and was so interested. There is a children's version of this book as well, but I bought the adult one. And this is about an enslaved woman named Elizabeth who works with a spy network run by Robert Townsend during the American Revolution. I don't know much more than that, to be honest, but it sounds really, really interesting. It was certainly a story that I had never heard of before, and talking to the author and hearing about the primary sources and the evidence that were used in writing this. As someone who loves history, I always love hearing that. So this is a really interesting edition as well, and I wish that I could tell you more about it, but I'm not reading right now. It's slow going, so I definitely wanted to make sure that I brought this up and added this to the conversation as well, in case you would like to add it to your list. Is this list exhaustive? No. This is just some of my favorites. Obviously, if you are interested in some other topics, I have plenty of other episodes in my American Presidents playlists that are up there. You can get books on so many other things, and I will hopefully be coming back to do more, like getting away from the American Revolution and different ways that we can tell the last 250 years through the eyes of some really great books about African American history, Native American history, so much good stuff that goes far broad and beyond the American Revolution and even the last 250 years. Like, I have one book that talks about the 500-year history of America, and one book that I think is essential to understanding our current kind of conglomerations in the country of different groups of people that go, again, beyond 1776, before that, the different groups of people who were there. So I hope that you will check back in for that video, because I'm really excited to tell you about those books too. But I wanted to start here, give you some books that are some of my favorites to kind of reframe and revisit the Revolution, and I will see you for my next 250th special, I hope. At the very least, I can share my favorites with you, because turns out for this challenge, this American Presidential Reading Challenge, I have read about 250 books. in time for the 250th. So I'll share a few with you next time. And in the meantime, you can always check out that playlist. I'll see you then, guys. Thanks. Bye.